the theme that we're going to be expanding upon in the upcoming sessions is this idea of building beautiful communities, and that's part of what we're striving to do here at the Hub, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So today, Shaykh Yahya will share with us some words on the prophetic model of successful communities, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And do think of questions and concerns that you have as well. So we have quite a bit of time till Maghrib, and I'm sure Shaykh Yahya won't speak all the way till Maghrib, but if he wants to, he's more than welcome. And before closing for Maghrib, we will inshallah also recite the Dua al-Nasiri, the prayer for the oppressed, for our brethren in Syria and elsewhere, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So do make the intention of benefiting from the words of Shaykh Yahya now.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa afdal as-salatu wa atammu at-taslim ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-'aliyyil 'azim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it's very nice to be with you here, always, in SeekersHub, place where seekers seek love. Hub, it's the hub of Hub, inshallah ta'ala. And alhamdulillah, that it goes without saying that in line with the very topic that we've been given tonight, which you're all exposed, you are regularly exposed to here in your community, that you have to be very thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that. And that ultimately, one of the very interesting things that I think is so important that we discuss, and I'll try to keep my comments fairly brief, and I would like to open it up for some not only Q&A, but also comments and discussions and so forth. There's a few kind of general remarks I'd like to make, and that first and foremost, that this whole idea of community, that there's different ways of looking at things, and that oftentimes when you're trying to put a puzzle together, that you don't get the pieces that you want, and you get certain pieces of the puzzle at certain times, and they have to be placed somewhere, or at least grouped with other seemingly like pieces, and then you get a few on the border. You don't know necessarily to place this, but then you'll find this one and kind of put it a little bit closer. And likewise, this is the state with our individual lives, but it's also the state with our communities. And one of the very important things to remember is that the spiritual path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a linear path, meaning that it's not about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and choosing each piece of the puzzle that you want. That things will come to you at different times, that you don't know why they're coming to you at that specific time, and it's upon you to accept it and benefit from it in that moment. And you might not understand why that came to you in that particular time except in retrospect. And this is why that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was from the prophetic du'as, Allahumma inni as'aluka min fujayati al-khair wa a'udhu bika min fujayati al-shar. That, oh Allah, I ask you for sudden good, and I seek refuge in you from sudden evil. Meaning that you don't know what's going to happen. You might have something right around the corner in the next 2 minutes of your life that is entirely life-changing, and that you were going down this track, and all of a sudden you take a complete right turn and go down an entirely different track based upon something that was entirely unexpected to you. And that oftentimes, not always, those things that come to you in an unexpected fashion are the things that are actually what are truly good for you. And those are usually the best things for you. Because if you plan it out with your own capacity and your own intellect and really try to think things through, that oftentimes that human beings, that our thought is very rarely that differentiated from having and being affected by our lower caprice and our lower desire. That generally speaking, that when it's left to you and you try to micromanage and plan, that your nafs has something to do with that. And in general, that if it's coming from the caprice, it's from the greater category of what's termed batil, and it's usually useless if not, if it doesn't at least pollute what and maybe even will pollute to various degrees whatever that pursuit or endeavor is. So this is really important to remember, is that the path to Allah Ta'ala on an individual basis, it's not linear. And that this is a part of our ubudiyah and our servitude to Allah Ta'ala to prepare ourselves to benefit from what is happening in every single moment, in hopes that collectively that it will lead to some greater result. So I say that because we're going to be talking in terms of theory about communities, and that it might not always be that it happens in the way that would be ideal, and that so there's always going to be a balance between theory, what we need to work towards, and between kind of dealing with the moment and whatever is coming your way. So it's a two-way type street. And that just as all of this applies to the individuals, again, this also applies, this also applies to communities. And I think it's very important. This would be a very interesting course to be taught here at Seekers, that I hope is taught one day. Is that we really need to be in tune with Islamic history in general. And even though this is not necessarily the most popular, science you would have studied if you studied in a traditional school. Actually, you would have probably studied very little, if at all. So it wasn't necessarily a part of a madrasa type curriculum. It wasn't a part of a traditional type curriculum. But there is an importance to history from for a number of reasons. But in our context, I think you could argue that one of the reasons it's important is so that we can, looking back on some of the historical precedents of the past, is that we can help start to make good decisions for the future. And that in particular, that I think every Muslim living in the West should be at least fairly comfortable and fairly familiar with the, most of the time, tenuous relationship between the quote-unquote West and Islam. And then even beyond that in particular, that the way that Islam now has really actually entered into the West, Europe, and then other Western places like South Africa, like Australia, and so forth and so on. And in reality, you could even argue that there's not even really much East left, and it is mostly all West. But that's another topic in of itself. But in particular, North America, because this is our context, is that how did Islam come to the country of Canada, the country of the United States, and then extending beyond that to North and South America, that we should be fairly familiar with that. And that it's really important because it will help us understand a little bit about the phase that we're in right now. And that, one of the, very interesting things that if we could just say about that, and if Sidney Naldum was here, I know he would always critique, trying to somehow couple, the history of Islam in the United States and the history of Islam in Canada. But I'm much more familiar with the United States types of things. But some of the things I'll be talking about, there definitely is overlap. And that, one of the very beautiful things that has really entered into a common knowledge of many Muslims within the past 20 years is this idea of traditional Islam, of classical Islam. Now, someone might say, well, how do you define traditional Islam? How do you define classical Islam? And that's a very good question. And one of the interesting things is that some people say is that if you look, 200 years ago, that there wasn't such a thing that really was outside of the realm of traditional Islam. Meaning that even though that there was differences amongst Muslims, all of them had a tradition. Meaning that whether across the Sunni Shiite split, even the Ibadis and others, is that they trace their heritage back, hundreds and hundreds of years. And it really only is at the onset of modernity is that we start to see the split from tradition, where there's new responses, and that there's different overarching brushstrokes that we can make about some of the tendencies of these various responses and so forth, which again you know, it'd also be a very important discussion I think that we need to have in a very candid way, because that at, you know, this level with everyone here, we probably might not have probably not a lot of tension when it comes to that. But when you deal with the youth in high school, the youth in college and so forth, it's a very different thing. The understandings that they're being fed and oftentimes exposed to are, you know, very different than many of these understandings that have been passed on, you know, century after century. And so that I see this is, you know, one of the most important landmarks in the coming of Islam to these continents, even though you could trace it back hundreds and hundreds of years, and that there was many people that took part in this, and that there were probably even Muslims here before Columbus, and then I'm speaking now primarily in the context of the United States, that the transatlantic slave trade, and then that the waves of immigration in the late 1900s, and then, you know, post-World War I, then post-World War II, but then not until the early to mid-60s, where in the United States there was reforms in the immigration law, that you started having significant amounts of Muslims migrating to the United States. And then really, it wasn't until the Cold War period where you started to have large numbers. And there's still so many people around today, and I'm sure the same here is in Canada. If you asked your father, maybe, if he's older, let alone your grandfather, how many mosques were here in Toronto, you know, if we would ask Auntie, like, how many mosques were here in Toronto, you know, 30 years ago, you know.
Just there was one Jami mosque, it was a church changed into a masjid, and that's
right.
basic.
And how many years ago was that?
That was, we're talking about the mid-80s.
Mid-80s. So Toronto now, that mashallah tabarakallah, that every, you know, 10 minutes that you can find a place to pray across the GTA. And I know I've been from Ajax to Mississauga. I know how long it takes. It's a long time, especially in your traffic here. But you could find mosques everywhere. And that's only, we're talking now, she's saying in the mid-80s there was like one, and maybe a few other small ones. That's really incredible to think about the growth. You know, that we don't, you know, oftentimes think about that. And that, you know, that's something that is spectacular. And then in particular in terms of the understanding that you also, I was with this, he loves, this man loves obscurity, so I'll refrain from mentioning his name. And he's older. He's from the generation of Shaykh Hamza and Imam Zaid, and I think he actually converted a little bit before them. And he was saying that, you know, he was, how happy he was to see people from the next generation. And I was just telling him some of my experiences and some of the people that I'm working with and some of the various things that we're doing and so forth. And he was just overjoyed. He said, because, you know, he didn't ever know that you know, these are back in the days where, you know, Muslims, converts were few and far between. And he said he'd been putting in work for, you know, year after year after year, and not knowing, you know, is this going to lead to something else and so forth. So that, you know, we're really privileged to live at this particular juncture, and that it's important to really think about this, that, you know, these two figures in particular that really popularized traditional Islam and classical Islam, i.e. Sheikh Nuh Keller and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and both of the incredible, you know, contributions that both of them made, you know, respectively. And I'm speaking about in a particular lens now. I know there's many other people that took part in this to various degrees, and that you find, you know, anomalies of a pocket of Sunni Muslims that existed in some city that were connected to a particular teacher back home that exists without doubt. But now that it's hard to find a Muslim home that doesn't have reliance of the traveler, the masterpiece, right? Even if they be Hanafis. Do you have reliance of the traveler? Mashallah, a few copies, see, who knows? That even if they be Hanafis, they have it on their shelf. And that it's hard to find a Muslim under the age of 40 who doesn't have at least a few lectures of Shaykh Hamza. And that, you know, so, you know, this is something that's been really interesting to see how this is kind of started. And, you know, then that as the ball starts rolling, and to be honest with you, one of the, you know, two most important hubs of, you know, I won't call it a traditional movement, but where this all was here in Toronto. That if you look at some of the communities that have been steeped in this type of understanding, one of the hubs of that actually was Toronto, as well as the Bay Area, and there's some other places here and there, but a large number of people that helped with that, and people that took part in this process of arranging various programs. Many of them actually were from the city, and so that then as this ball is rolling, at least in the outward realm, that we had the event of September 11th. Now again, I'm not trying to give, these are just thoughts, and this is from my subjective perspective, and it's limited what I'm telling you, but I'm just putting this out there, and then it's just hopefully going to spark some thoughts in your own mind. Maybe you have a different perspective, maybe you have something to add. That pre 9/11 and then post 9/11, that Muslims really are a very, outwardly speaking, insignificant percentage of the population of the United States and Canada. We're not a significant percentage, and that as for significance and quality, that's something else. Muslims are the backbone. We're لولاهم بين الأنام لدكتكت من ارتكاب الخطيئة لدكتكت الجبال من ارتكاب الخطيئة. Were it not to be that there are these hidden awliya amongst creation, that the mountains would be split asunder and be pulverized from people sinning. Right? So in reality, that the Muslim saints that are still alive are the ruh of the world, and were it not to be for them, that there wouldn't be anything in existence. Right? But so in terms of the significance, in terms of meaning, that's another topic. But in terms of numbers, that Muslims are fairly insignificant in terms of numbers. And then post 9/11, so pre 9/11, that we were under the radar, so to speak. That here and there was a few issues, and that from the divine plan of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, that there are certain things taking place in the Middle East that have catapulted Muslims, even obviously before 9/11, to the world scene, and but in terms of this particular notion of the spread of Islam and that the growing, emerging Muslim communities in the West, that this is something that, for the most part, Muslims were underneath the radar. And that what I've noticed, though, is that post 9/11, is that this ball was rolling, where there was this surge of students of knowledge, of people that wanted to go study. When people came back from overseas, in particular Sheikh Hamza, and then that there was others that then went, people like Imam Zaid Shakir, people like Sheikh Jihad Brown, people like Ustad Ibrahim Hosiafa, and the numbers of others, and then some that came after them, and then that there was a surge where people would go overseas and study. But post 9/11, it seems that all of a sudden that the efforts and focus and concentration of many people, that as what I would argue, we'll talk about this, is the most important development of what we need to do to build a community here. Many of the efforts of those people started to be diverted into different focuses. And that people were catapulted into the realm of the media, that they were into, it was damage control at this point, because there was a lot of unknown. We didn't know exactly what was going to actually take place and happen. And that's persisted now for several years. And that you have this huge gap now, where that as this thing started and people dedicated their lives to it, then they come back and the attention is just shifted. And that it's not to say that everything was worked out fully in the earlier stages. However, at the same time, that there is recognizable difficulties of those that have taken this path and then wanting to come back and try to find that balance here within the lands which we live. And that having said that, let's talk about this point for a little bit. That from an objective perspective, really, is that bringing these meanings of traditional and classical Islam to these lands in which we live to me is the greatest landmark in the history of Islam to these lands. This is the most important thing, because that these understandings are going to create the necessary environment for that true Muslim people to grow in and become. These understandings, these meanings, whether they be on the realm of belief, whether they be on the realm of character, whether they be on the realm of practice and law and so forth, this is what it's going to be, is it's going to create someone that is going to ultimately going to be able to contribute. And that being exposed to this for me is what made it a no-brainer to me. This is what did, when I first read one of these incredible manuals that we have, that even though they're short and concise, that they're extremely comprehensive, that just pushed me to end up taking the stint that the Fakir did overseas. So that this is extremely important, because that everywhere Islam spread is that at a particular juncture this same thing happened, and that it's not done with books. It is done with books indirectly, but it's done with living links in the chain of hearts that are alive, that have connected back to the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? This is the key. That it's not going to be done by passing out pamphlets. Right? There's been books around for a long time, even though the quality of books now is much greater. There's been books around for a long time. Now, there's been translations of the Qur'an around for a long time. But the key is, though, is that to have living, walking people who now they in and of themselves are a part of this chain. That meaning that there's a reality to it. And one of the interesting things is to think of this idea of synthesis. And that ultimately what's going to synthesize any dichotomy is the human being. Because the human being is the ultimate, if you will, synthesizer. And don't think of anything to do with music or amplifier or something of that sort. But the human being has this incredible ability. And if you even look at the internal makeup of the human being, is that we're made up of clay. Essentially, what's in the stars is in our flesh, is in our bodies. But at the same time, we have a ruh. We're a composite being that has synthesized these two entities that are completely opposites, spirit and flesh. But at the same time, every single one of us has a little bit of both in them. And that this is the secret of the human being. And this is why that when Dr. Amar Farooq Abdullah was here, which I'm sure he already discussed with you all, is the dominant name in the human being is Al-Jami'. That Allah Ta'ala is the uniter, the joiner, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning the human being has this ability to not only join between these two realities that are entirely juxtaposed to one another, but we have the ability to make sense out of everything. We have the ability to understand everything that can possibly be understood. And it's this human ability to synthesize is what makes us uniquely human. And this is done in the highest, most spiritual and metaphysical way. But this is also done in a very outward way as well. It's synthesizing between that various things. That outwardly, when you speak about it in a rational sense, might seem to be that you can't mix the two, but you can. And so this whole idea of all of these things that we're trying to deal with now. How do we reconcile our identity that we've learned from our parents, and then when we go out into the public sphere? That how do we reconcile between the aql and naql, the rational sciences and the transmitted sciences? How do we reconcile between the materialism of this world and our spirituality? How do we reconcile between that being faithful to our deen and living in Western society? How do we reconcile all these type of things that we're living right now as we speak and doing, that even though that people are also philosophizing about them? But the amazing thing about the human being is that that synthesis is going to take place in you. And you have the ability to do it. And so that you'll reach a certain point where that I don't, and this is something that I thank Allah for, because that I used to feel, and I'm not saying this in that, well, I probably shouldn't say people might think I'm racist or something. I've actually felt, ever since I came back overseas, I felt like a fob. So I call myself a fob, right? Fresh off the boat, or a fop, fresh off the plane, right? I've always felt a bit displaced, because once the nature of this society, it's a spider's web, and it's difficult to get out once you're kind of caught in, and then that once you get out of the system and you come back into the system, it's even more difficult. Even very simple things like, you need a credit card even if you're going to pay it at the end of every month, but you come back and haven't had a credit card for 10 years, and they won't even give you a credit card. You have to put a deposit down, get a secured credit card, and show them that you'll, for a year, that, not abuse it, and then they'll give you a small little credit line, and then so forth and so on. Or coming back, that I remember my wife and I came back to California, that, been married since 2002, and then all of a sudden we're trying to rent a place, and they ask for your rental history. So I'm at this point, like, however old I was, maybe 28, 29 or something like that, whatever. And they're like, you have no rental history. What's wrong with you? You're married? You have no rental history. Like, getting back into the society is very difficult. Let alone that if you would try to apply for a regular type job or something like that. That's just part of the society in which we're in. So that it is set up such that, especially if you've been used to, the good aspects of Muslim society. Because despite all the problems, there's still extremely rewarding and beautiful aspects of the Muslim world that everyone should experience and can experience. But the whole point is that it took me a few years to kind of start feeling comfortable, and that interesting enough that it was actually going back to the university and interacting with people in a very close way that opened up amazing doors for myself, and that it reaches a point now where that from the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I don't have an ikhtiyar anymore. Now, I'm not saying in like a Sufi spiritual sense, that's a high maqam, but I'm saying that feeling comfortable in where we are is that, and to me this has been one of the most liberating feelings, is that just feeling comfortable and really feeling like these people are our people. These are our people, this is our qawm. And keep in mind that the Battle of Uhud, them coming to the Prophet ﷺ, wanting him to make dua against them, and what did our Prophet say? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Allahum ihdi qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. And fi riwayat, Allahum ighfir li qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. That, oh Allah, guide my qawm. Your qawm is your people. Guide my qawm because they don't know. Meaning these are people that are at war with the Prophet ﷺ, that are trying to erase him and eradicate his teachings and erase him from the face of this earth. And our Prophet is saying that they are qawmi. So even in the height of their enmity, they're still his qawm, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so that if the most vehement opponent and detractor of Islam is from, the Prophet is saying he's from his qawm, then what about people that are just misinformed? What about people actually who are doing more for the cause of Muslims and Islam than even Muslims themselves? That how much more so should we see these people from our qawm? And I know that you'll find a whole bunch of strands of way of thinking out there that are very different than this, that will try to even question the very things that I'm saying. But Allah Ta'ala says about the Prophet Hud, وَإِلَىٰ عَادٍ أَخَاهُمْ هُودًا, to the people of Ad, their brother Hud. So Hud, the people of Hud, the Prophet Hud, that Ad, the majority of them disbelieved in him. But Allah Ta'ala says, calls Hud their brother. So meaning that he was still a brother of the people of Ad, even despite their disbelief and their obstinate rebellion. They were still brothers. And this is, this is a necessary trait and feeling you have to have in your heart if you're going to affect your people. And again, we should all feel like these are our people. And that this is one of the most beautiful things. And when we were at the Seekers Guidance retreat last year, which I have to say was the most beautiful retreat I've ever been to. And that when Dr. Omar was there, that in his opening discussion, one of the beautiful things that he said is, he says that we should all feel very welcome here. And there was a picture at the back of Chief Sequoia, who was wearing what looked like he was like a Turkish jubba. And he said that the Native Americans would have welcomed you here. He said these trees, around you are welcoming you here. And this is not, something, this is very real. Is that in some athar that different streets will compete with one another. Say, did a dhakir billah, yani hal mar bik dhakir billah? Did a one who remembered Allah Ta'ala pass by you? And Allah said, فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ السَّمَاء, that the heavens, in relation to those who disbelieve, that the heavens didn't cry on their behalf. And Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib said that when a person dies, is that there's two places that weep for them. Is that one is their mas'ad of their amal, the place that their actions used to ascend into heaven. And the second place is where they used to worship in the earth. Is that it will actually weep in a way that Allah Ta'ala knows, except the true nature of that weeping, that for the person who used to worship that. And so from this perspective, that we're at home here. And that we in reality, whether we're welcomed or not, if people knew what we were bringing to these societies, they would pay us to be here. They would pay us. Were they to know the blessing of SeekersHub? Were they to know the blessing of Risada? Were they to the blessing of Lotri? Were they to know the blessing of all of these different masajid that are here in the GTA and all of the various organizations, and that the blessing of having the Iqamat and Jum'ah here, and the calamities that are warded off from the people of Canada because Muslims are here? This is very real. That were they to know that, and there be some way to, perceive that, they would welcome us here. Because that Allah Ta'ala says about our Prophet that مَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُ وَأَنْتَ فِيهِمْ, that it wasn't befitting for Allah Ta'ala to punish them and you are among them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning that the Prophet being amongst them is that it was a protection for his people, even the disbelievers, from maskh, transfiguration and other things. But that وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ وَيَسْتَغْفِرُونَ, or it wasn't befitting for Allah Ta'ala to punish them while they are seeking forgiveness. Right? Meaning that these meanings have to be rooted in our heart, because this is going to give us izzah, and that this is going to help us do what it is that we need to do in the future. And so that if we're going to discuss community, that the two cents that in the few comments that I wanted to just say about that is that I really feel it's important that understanding just kind of an overview of the history of Islam in general to this stage in Western countries, and Canada, United States in particular, and some of the trends therein, and then in particular it pertains to the spread of a classical traditional understanding of Islam, is that there's certain things that need to be in place for the growth of our communities in the future. And that many of the beautiful trajectories that are filling in various pieces of the puzzle, that alhamdulillah, anyone that's of any service to the deen, that this is what our teachers taught us, anyone that's of any service to the deen, wherever they might be in the world, is that we should do everything that we can to support them. However, that there are also a list of priorities of things that are essential and the most important of the essential. And then, our scholars have dealt with this. There's certain things that are necessities. There's other things that are hajat and needs. And then there's other things that are from the realm of just, luxuries. That there's things that will, tahsinat, will better a situation. And that learning to focus on the various levels is also very important. And so that I would say that you know, there needs to be a pretty serious paradigm shift, and that we need to collectively recognize that what is the most important thing for us to do in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years in our context. And that this will be one of the most blessed types of fikr, of reflection that you could possibly do. This is a type of fikr that is beloved to Allah and His Messenger. And it's one of the best ways to draw near to Allah and draw near to the Messenger is to actually spend time reflecting that what is the good for the Muslim Ummah? What can I do for the Muslim Ummah? And that is precious, and that you get a very large reward from Allah Ta'ala for it. And these are the type of acts actually that are some of the acts that penetrate the veils. That is because that they're not related to anything, any hadh of your own nafs, a portion of your own nafs. This is related to the betterment of the community in general. And that it seems to me, and having spoken to Shaykh Faraz and a large number of other people, that we really need to root ourselves in the people. We have to establish communities. We have to be rooted in the people. That we have to not just have a relationship and interaction with one person and that's it. That we need to get beyond that model. That model worked for a particular period of time, it's important for a particular period of time, and it's still going to remain important. Any type of outward whatever arrangement that's going to have to lead to this type of interaction, that's always going to be important. But more important than that is that establishing individual relationships, so that every new person that comes to Seekers Hub, that it's not just they're coming to Seekers Hub one night and that's it. That they're going to become a part of a family. They're going to become part of a long-term relationship, which most importantly is not going to end in this world. If every person you met, every Muslim, and that you met, is that you're intending to have an eternal relationship with. Imagine how that's going to change that interaction that you're going to have with that individual, and your concern for that individual. And that there's people that are like this. That whenever they meet anyone, that's their intention. Is that they want to have an eternal relationship with this individual that is going to extend far beyond this world. Not only is it going to be with people while they're in this world, this is going to remain with them in the barzakh and Yawm al-Qiyamah and then in the akhirah. And that every brother or sister that you acquire for the sake of Allah Ta'ala, that it's an increased darajah, it's an increased rank, it's an increased degree in paradise. And that this is what's going to really help us build. And we have to think about this really seriously, of how to build viable communities. Because this is one of our biggest challenges. If we cannot work out how to build communities long term, and what's the nature of a community in light of the greater community in which we live, then we're never going to be successful. Right? That this whole talk about sustainability, and that it's really worth deeply thinking about. How can we create, not only in terms of our own selves, sustainable religious practice? How can we have sustainable families? How can we have sustainable local and then global communities? This is a huge task, and that what makes it so difficult is that there's so many different things hammering away. That as you're trying to build, that it's taking from the foundation from here, it's taking from the foundation. There's forces that are trying to undermine this process. That whether they be overt or covert type forces, that they're there, and so that it's not something that is necessarily easy. But at the same time, that we should never despair. It can be done, and that there's ways of doing that, and that this is one of the ways of doing that is that many of the initiatives that Seekers Guidance has, and starting the Seeker Circle, and that having an online presence and connecting people and encouraging people to get together from different places, to get together and then learn, and that the opening of different Seekers Hubs in different places. And this is at the realm of Seekers Guidance, but then on top of that is the relationship of Seekers Guidance to other Muslim organizations. Is that we should have a type of open-heartedness to work with anyone to various degrees, that that there is a maslahah or benefit for the Muslim Ummah, and that this applies in a very specific sense of those people that are closest to you, that there's certain things that you're going to do in the realm of work for the sake of the deen, that, you know, is a good percentage of your time. And then if you move broader as well, there's certain things that you're going to do with the broader spectrum of people that is also you know, somewhat limited in its. And then there's certain things you're going to work with all Muslims across the divides, because there's a maslahah or benefit that's for all Muslims. Then there's going to be certain things that you work towards with faith-based communities that's in the benefit of anyone who has a faith-based understanding. Then there's going to be certain things based upon certain masalih and blessing and benefits that you're going to work with the entire, you know, human population. So that we should see it as such. And there's going to be certain things that you don't work with people on. That's you know, that's definitely the case. But to me, this is the conversation that we really need to have. Is that what are these various things that we need to be working with these various groups? What are they? Getting beyond the theory. Okay, we've heard the theory time and time again. Let's get down into tangibles and get beyond this and actually get to work. And this is, for me, is that this is what makes me move. This is what, you know, I think we really need to do moving forward. Is that we need to have real engagement, real interactions, right, where there's certain things that we're willing to sacrifice, and that we're moving forward, and that we want to have a type of setup such that someone converts, there's a place for them to go, that everything is covered, the circle is complete. There's a physical location, there's outreach, there's an online presence, that there's working between you know, different groups, that there's specialization, that you find someone, you send them to so-and-so, or they send someone to so-and-so, and hakadha. And that this is all, you know, not difficult to do, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so wills. But some of the particular insights that pertain to, you know, a community in and of itself, that our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that whose example is the ultimate example, when he went to Medina, which is really where we see the first outward manifestations of the building of the community. Because Mecca, even though Al-Mukarramah, that stage, even though that they didn't have the community they had in Medina, that was the precursor to Medina. Meaning that you have to build the meaning first. And they built the meaning for 13 years in the hearts of people before they even went to Medina. And that's the most important thing for anything, is that you build the meaning strong first. And then that everything outward will come from that. If you get ahead of yourself and you start building buildings before you start building meaning, that, you know, I've seen even recently in her stories of various organizations, institutions that were up and running for a period of time and then shut down. Spent enormous amounts of money on buildings, and then no one uses them. That large acreage and empty. Nothing's happening. They're not being utilized. And that how many times have we seen that of this type of thing? That different attempts at opening schools or whatever it might be, and because there's no people there to bring those meanings to life, that it's empty. And then you find, and this is that you find people as well that are living meaning in ways that no one else is, but they have almost no resources to be able to do anything with it. I was just at an event not too long ago in Orlando, Florida, and we were with some beautiful people there. And there was this one Latino family where a brother converted, and then his brother converted, then his sister converted, then the mother converted, the aunt converted, his cousin converted, and that he was saying in his particular area where he lives, he says that people want guidance. He says, but he didn't even have enough money to get Spanish translations of the Qur'an to even pass out to people. right? And this is someone who, that you have just a slight amount of resources and he's going to have an incredible impact upon those that are around him. But he didn't even have the basic resources to even do something as, as like purchase a translation of the Qur'an to pass out to someone. But he's living a life of meaning and effect, and even though that be the case. So that the precursor to Mecca, to Medina was Mecca, but then the very first thing that our Prophet did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when he went to Medina, was that he built his masjid, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the second thing that he did was that he established a brotherhood between the Muhajirin and the Ansar. The third thing that he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that he started their own souk, their own marketplace for buying and selling. And so that if you look at the wisdom in the Prophet ﷺ doing this, there's the religious dimension, there's the social dimension, and then there's the economic dimension. And that meaning all three of these aspects are of the utmost importance. And the foundation of it all is, though, is the religious dimension, which is the masjid. So meaning that one of the crises of our communities is the masjid in them itself. With all of these different masajid that we have now, that what is the state of each masjid in relation to one another, and in relation to the people that are coming there, and between the board and the people and so forth, of the imam and all of the other issues that many of you know much more details about than I do. That what is the state of our masjid? Meaning that you can't have a solid community. This is the prophetic model, unless that is sound. So meaning that you can't avoid it. Yes, you have to have band-aids, you have to create new social space, that you have to have places where you come together, that there's always going to be certain things that you do that not necessarily you would do normally in a masjid. Right? Because the primary focus of a masjid is the Bayt of Allah. It's the 5 daily prayers, and it's Jummah. That's the primary focus of the masjid. For the most part in the Muslim world, is that the mosque in and of itself, that's what it's used for. That even though you do have presence in our Islamic centers where we do all of these other functions, there were examples of that in Muslim history where there was a mosque, and then attached to that was a whole complex where there was a soup kitchen, and then there was a zawiya, and then there was a library, and then other things of this sort. That is there for sure. But the primary function is the religious function. And that what is the nature of how our mosques are, how welcoming are our mosques? What is the nature of the Friday prayer? We have a whole array of bid'ah hasanas that we could have a beautiful manifestation of Jummah here in our lands. There's a whole array. The bid'ah hasana, that the good innovation is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a blessing in the division of bid'ah into 5 categories. The bid'ah hasana, not only should we not be afraid to say that we should reach the level of religious maturity where we actually see the blessing of the bid'ah hasana. Why? Because if it wasn't a blessing, why would it be there? The whole purpose, the whole blessing of the bid'ah hasana is that there's certain things that we need in later times that the earlier times didn't need. So the mawlid that we're going to do in the future, that's a bid'ah hasana. But it's a blessing of Allah Ta'ala. Why is it a blessing of Allah Ta'ala? Because which one of us is like the Sahabi who's amongst his family, leaves his house and says, Ya Rasulullah, I was with my family, I started thinking about you, and I just had to come see you. When was the last time we had that emanate from our heart? When was the last time when we were so we couldn't sleep out of love of Rasulullah, and we stood up and we just were uneasy? When was the last time that happened to any one of us? When was the last time that we actually just sat on our own, reflecting on what the Prophet looked like, reflecting upon his character, reflecting upon a particular event of the seerah? When was the last time that happened? So the fact that we have something like a mawlid to stir these meanings in our heart, to have a time, at least once a week, for instance, that we think about the Prophet ﷺ, this is an incredible blessing of Allah Ta'ala. Or the bid'ah hasana of that having a munasabah, a function where we remember the Laylat Isra wal Mi'raj. Which it doesn't matter. There's a difference of opinion about the actual day. There's even a difference between about the day the Prophet was born. But many of our scholars say it's the 27th of Rajab, right around the corner, the next few days. But it's not about the day, even if it actually didn't happen. The point is that when was the last time that we actually sat and thought about the latest Isra Mi'raj? So the fact that many of our scholars have said this is something that is a bid'ah hasanah, but permissible because it has a foundation in the Sharia. And at the same time, it's to reconnect us to that particular event. It's a yearly opportunity for us to relive what took place and all the lessons that were in it. And the same thing applies for the Battle of Badr. The same thing applies for these different days that throughout the year that help us remember different events that took place from the time of the Prophet. These are just two examples. But what I'm saying is that there's a whole number of things that we can do to have a very rich and fulfilling experience on Jummah. So not only is it that people just come in and out because, you know, they don't even want to see someone, you know, I just gave Jummah at the Adam Center. And this man came up to me just grumpy. And just, you know, I knew something was coming. And I was trying to be patient and smile. But he's just like, you know, there's people next to me, this, that, they can't even line up correctly, that, and this, and, you know, they're bowing this and praying like this. And he says, Adam Center, right? He says, I don't like Adam Center, or whatever. He just kind of like grumbled off and this type of thing. You know, I'm like, yeah, you're right. We should remind them. Yeah, what am I going to say? Right? But at the end of the day, it's like, miskeen, right? What kind of energy is that? That if you can't, what is that? Our mosque should be the most merciful and welcoming of places. I mean, what's the whole purpose of a mosque? The reason it's important is because this is the essential religious function in the community to connect you to your Lord. If a mosque is not welcoming and inclusive, then how is that going to happen then? Right? I'm not saying there's not an adab and comportment that goes to the mosque. Absolutely. There's sharia, there's rules, all of that, absolutely. But I'm also saying as well that we should welcome people. And if you're going to advise someone, that just smile and like give them a cookie and then tell them something or whatever. Right? Seriously, that we have to advise people. I mean, I went to attend Jummah and there's this man selling food outside during Jummah. Right? He's selling sandwiches during Jummah. That's totally haram. In the Shafi madhab, from the time of the first adhan, it's makruh. Once the second adhan is called, it's haram. And you're doing it during Jummah, selling sandwiches. Right? But at the same time, you don't go out and right? Smile, thank. This is Jummah. Remind it. I just want to remind you the kicker. Right? We tend to forget that the asl of amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, the foundation is that you do it gently and with mercy, and always with mercy. Even when we have to be stern, it's still done with mercy. But this vibe has to be brought to our masajid. Otherwise, is that people are going to flee from the masajid. And that this is at the heart of the community. And then everything else that pertains to that is the religious side of things, where that we have to have an understanding. In order for us to have communities, we have to understand La ilaha illallah. What I mean by that is we have to understand the weight of La ilaha illallah. It's that La ilaha illallah is the weightiest word in existence. Our entire deen is La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah were to be placed on one side of the scale, so the 7 heavens and 7 earths on the other side of the scale, it would have outweighed it. Meaning, this was something when I converted in 1996, that you're told that you've joined a family now 1.4 billion deep. And then, 2 months later, it shrunk in half. Then, 2 months later, it's only 1/10 of those people that you can actually be around. And then, smaller and smaller, and then all of a sudden, even in your own mosque, don't be around him, don't be around him, don't be around him, think this about him, this time, to the point that you only have now that a few hundred people and the rest of the ummah is astray. And that there's a beautiful book that should become, minhaj. It's a book that everyone should read. hopefully someday, at least selections, or the methodology we translate is called Sanan al-Muhtadin. And it's by the last great Maliki scholar that they say, Khatimat al-Ulama al-Malikiin, Imam Ibn al-Muwaq. And he comments on the verse of Allah Ta'ala, ثُمَّ أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مُقْتَصِدٌ وَمِنْهُمْ سَابِقٌ بِالْخَيْرَاتِ. Then we bequeath the book to those that we have chosen from amongst our servants. From among them are those that have pressed themselves. From among them are those that are in the middle. And from among them are those that are the foremost of every good. And meaning that if you look at this verse, it says that we bequeath the book. ثُمَّ أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ. Then we bequeath the book. الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا. To those that we have chosen from our servants. فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Among them, but keep in mind, the chosen servants are those that are ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ, that they have oppressed their own soul. Meaning that someone that might not be in the best of states, but they're still a chosen servant of God. This is Nas al-Qur'an. This is an explicit verse in the Qur'an. Meaning that the essence of bid'ah is to call someone a mubtada or dal or misguided or an innovator when they're doing something that there's a difference of opinion amongst scholars. Is that the essence of bid'ah is to call this person mubtada or dal. You can call them dhalim li nafsihi. You could say that there's something better for them to be doing, that they're oppressing themselves. Absolutely. Ma fi mushkila. There's no problem there. Right? But to call them dhal or mubtada, that is the essence of bid'ah. Is to call someone, if there's any scholarly difference, that they're misguided. So that's food for thought. Meaning that, it took me years to get back to the level where I love all Muslims. I had to reclaim that. And that we should love everyone that says, La ilaha illallah. Without over-romanticizing the differences. There's irreconcilable differences between us and the Shia. Marhaba. Irreconcilable. You're not going to reconcile those differences. But, do you not love the fact that they say, La ilaha illallah? Absolutely. That you love every Muslim who says, La ilaha illallah. Even though you might disagree in particulars that pertain to belief, practice, spirituality, or whatever. That yes, absolutely. At one level, yes. Meaning that in order for you to be a means to bring back the spirit of our masajid and help their function and to really build a viable community, you have to know the meaning of La ilaha illallah. And you have to understand the sanctity of La ilaha illallah and how that pertains to the other believers. And there's many more other things that could be said. These are just examples, but this is at the heart of the whole thing. And then also that there has to be, an active quest amongst every Muslim to pursue knowledge. Knowledge for us in Islam is paramount. Knowledge is the most important thing of all. That in terms of the beginning and in terms of the end. And that also along the way. Knowledge is paramount. We have to revive the quest to seek sacred knowledge. And that even though it's becoming more and more difficult now to go seek sacred knowledge in places overseas, is that this is the wajib of our walk. This is the obligation of our time, is that we have to build institutions where people can learn. Where people can have, they can learn their individual obligations, that they can learn their communal obligations, and then that they can have an active path of learning that is going to last a lifetime. And that it's a very interesting quote that Imam al-Haddad in his introduction to his book Ad-Da'wah Tamma, The Perfect Call, that he ends his introduction by quoting a long passage of one of the statements of Imam Zaid. And essentially, to sum up what that quote says, as Imam Zaid says, is that everyone is required to learn what is obligatory upon them. And then they're required to teach that to those that are around them, from their family, and then from in their vicinity, and then extending beyond that. And then he says, until the edge of the entire dunya. Right? Meaning that has to be there in terms of concern. Is that there are people in different places of the world that, from the very fact that there's not people reaching out to them, are remaining in the depths of darkness. Because there's not people reaching out to them. There's something about that stirring up these meanings in the heart of a believer, because if they say La ilaha illallah, even if they've only said it once in their life, there is a sweetness in their heart. There's sugar in their heart. But it's like if someone puts sugar in tea and you don't stir it, you don't taste the sweetness. All you have to do is just... Muslims have so much khair. All you have to do is just, gently speak to them, and then they come back to life. And then you'd be surprised at how many people that they have a rebirth. They come back and they start learning, and so forth and so on. And that, so, these meanings we have to recognize that, studying sacred knowledge is the most noble thing that you can do. It is the single most noble thing that you can do. That this idea now that people have of criticizing the mullah and seeing these people as just people that don't have any other income and like beg, and they're just coming to teach us because they don't have any money. As long as we're in this state, there's no hope for a true future. Is that we have to put things in their proper perspective. That were you to have a choice between getting a PhD at Harvard and between studying traditionally in, with great teachers, if you had to choose between the two, that to me, that, we have to, I'm not saying don't get a PhD at Harvard. What I'm saying is in your heart, know what is truly important. And that religious knowledge is the most important knowledge. And that we should be encouraging people to study religious knowledge. And that the idea of talab al-ilm, of getting back to studying and learning, that, and I'm speaking to myself in this because oftentimes you get so preoccupied that you don't get to continually seek knowledge. And I was, had this experience recently where we were able to go through a text that I was familiar with, but we went through it with a teacher recently. And it was just one of those moments, it like brings you back to life. Because there's something about seeking sacred knowledge that it brings your heart to life. That you go about unaffected. That the thing is, there's always going to be problems in the dunya. And we spent the night last night in Buffalo, New York. We were eating breakfast this morning, and you see these people come in and like watching the news, or they hear about something, and then all of a sudden they look and this type of thing. And I mean, the news, yes, be informed what's going on in the world, but don't be a slave to it. Right? Meaning that the world's the world. It's going to go on as it's going to go on. It's always been like this. It's going to continue to be like this. The point is that what about you, though? What are you doing? And that you'll find that if you, create a space for yourself to constantly learn, that you will be unaffected by much of what is going wrong around you. And you will be totally fulfilled in and of yourself. I'm not saying you don't have a concern what's going on. I'm not saying that you'll try to better the situation, but you will be largely unaffected by what is going on around you. And you will be doing the single most important thing that you need to do, which is that we need, that's at the heart of the community, is to preserve the integrity of the tradition for the later generations. So any type of critique that's trying to take from that, we can argue about that. That's fine. We'll argue about that. Because that's what's most important. Even that act in and of itself of preserving the integrity of tradition, that's one of the most important things of all. So that it remains for the later, the later generation. And even that Shaykh Yahya Rhodus, and one of his works about the scholars, that he says that there was this one scholar who died learning, and that they asked him, someone saw him in a dream after he died, and he said Ma fa'ala bik, what did Allah do with you? Or they asked him, how was your death? And the man said that I was so preoccupied in studying that the angel of death took my soul and I didn't even notice. He had so much istighraq, and he was so into his study that the angel of death came, took his soul while he was studying. That's a husn al-khatimah. That is a good seal. There's one of the great Ba'alawi scholars, Hadramaut, named Imam Muhammad bin Ali Sahib al-Ama'im. His epithet is the Sahib al-Ama'im, the possessor of turbans, because they said that he studied for, he had 17 turbans burn up while he was studying. Because he'd be, in those days they used to study by like candlelight or by like a lamp. And he'd be leaning over, he'd get so into his studies that he wouldn't realize that his imamah would catch on fire. Right? His imamah would catch on fire, and he had 17 imamahs, turbans burn up because he was so preoccupied with his study. There's another example, this is like, the sisters aren't going to like this story, but we'll tell it. It has a good meaning, so bear with me. That there's one of the great imams as well, that on the night he got married, that someone gave him a copy of the Shifa, Qadi Iyad, the great book by Qadi Iyad Shifa. So he just got the book, and then he finally went back into the room, and he's alone with his bride, and he sees this book. And so he goes and he starts reading, and he just keeps reading. And he finishes the book and it's Fajr time. And then his mom walks in the morning and she sees him reading this book, just as Fajr's about to enter, and that his new bride is on, laying down. She fell asleep in like a corner of the room, still dressed in her clothes. She's like, what happened? And then he told her, he told her what had happened. He was so into his book, and then that she made a dua against him. I'm not going to tell you what the dua is, but she made dua against him. And then that, because of the traces of that dua, there's something he had to always do because of that dua that his mother made against him. The point is, that's a bit, he's ma'bur because he wasn't intentional. So if that's an intentional thing, that's not a very nice thing to do. But the sisters, I've told you, would not be happy with that example. The point is that we should love to learn and constantly learn, and that needs to come back into our community, right? An appreciation for seeker knowledge, and then a place where students of knowledge can go, and then that people respecting those of people of knowledge. And there's still places today that you go in the Muslim world, is that they have a deep appreciation for students of knowledge. And that I was just learning from a friend who, when he was going to meet Marabat al-Hajj, that he was driving by land from Morocco into Mauritania, and that he didn't even have a visa or anything of that sort. And they asked the border, "Where are you going?" Right, "I'm going to see Marabat al-Hajj." Marabat al-Hajj. His visa was Marabat al-Hajj. He just kept saying, "I'm going to Marabat al-Hajj." And there still very much is amongst the people there that, you mention Marabat al-Hajj, okay. Like, they see themselves as, wanting to help and facilitate the student of knowledge. But this has to be a culture here. And even though it's not here now, even though it's changed after 9/11, even though people are focusing on a whole bunch of other different things, all of these other initiatives are good. Right? All of these other initiatives, as long as they're in the parameters of the Sharia, are good. They should be supported, encouraged, ahlan wa sahlan. But there's conditions. One, they should be based upon knowledge. And two, that we should understand is that the heart of all of that is creating a culture of learning, where people really want to learn, and that people are actively learning. And this is something that the last time I remember going to, Damascus, and Allah Ta'ala bring the people of Damascus quick relief, that, it was unbelievable. This was a few years ago. Just unbelievable. The masajid were full. You would go to the masajid between Maghrib and Isha. These are people that work all day long. And the masajid were full. There were so many different classes taking place at different times and different dhikr gatherings. The entire city felt alive. I was like, oh my God. Because it was like that for my short stint there in 1999. But this coming back like 10 years later, that it just exponentially increased. And it was unbelievable. We're not talking about we're talking about thousands of people. Right? And this is what needs to happen. And we shouldn't be content until we see that happen. If there's 500,000 Muslims, as they say, in the GTA, right, where are they? Really, where are they? Right? They should, you know, إذا مررتم برياض الجنة فارتعوا وقيل وما رياض الجنة يا رسول الله حلق الذكر. If you pass by the gardens of paradise, graze therein. And what are the gardens of paradise, Ya Rasulullah? The gatherings of learning. Those are the gardens of paradise. That is what's going to open up for you. And لعل في هذا إشارة to what we mentioned about being unaffected. If you're in a garden of paradise, that's the whole point. You are going to be unaffected by everything that is taking place around you. Right? Because you're in a garden of paradise. And that you're doing something that is, you know, at the very heart of what human beings aspire and desire to. And so that, you know, then you could go into great detail about the brotherly aspect of, you know, having a strong brotherhood and a strong sisterhood. Some of that relates to what we already mentioned about the importance of understanding the implications of La ilaha illallah. And then you could go as well to discuss the economic, you know, aspect of it. That these just are very just rudimentary, you know, insights, you know, but these type of things, you know, this really needs to be studied and taken very seriously. But I really hope in general, you know, as a community, that we can start getting beyond a lot of the constraints and restraints for what really needs to be done. Because there's a lot of reasons why make people say, okay, well, it can't be done because of A, B, and C. Okay, cost is a problem. Okay, this and that. But to have the courage to break through this stuff, these you know, apparent restraints, that's really what we need. You know, to really reach the point where that we know, you know, we want to live a real life where it's very real. You know, where someone needs your help, you're willing to help them. You're willing to stay up late at night for one person. You're willing to travel to the Yukon Territory for one person. And I was just, not too long ago, I was in Glasgow, Scotland, and there was a fundraiser for a group called New to Islam. And the blessed brother and sister who run this organization, may Allah reward them and gives them the greatest of this world and the next. That these people, La ilaha illallah, that people will call them in the middle of the night and they will go and help them. One person. They traveled hours to go see one person because that person was in need. Right? That to me is Islam. You know, if we're just comfortable and, you know, if it's hard for us to even come to Seekers Hub for a 1-hour lecture during the week, and then we retire to our, you know, comfortable lives in the suburbs. Right? Yes, inshallah, we'll all enter into paradise. But to me, that you know, that wasn't the spirit of the Sahaba. You know, and that you know, we should have high himmah to get beyond just, you know, functional Islam. Is that we want to be people of quality. We want to be people who, you know, have the courage to really, you know, hit this thing head on. That we want Islam to take root in our own heart, most importantly, to make the intellectual, spiritual, and religious synthesis, and then share that with others. And we want Islam to take root in these countries. And as controversial as anyone might say that might be, is that Islam is going to adorn these countries, just as the ways it has adorned our hearts. We know what is done for us, and it's going to adorn these people as well. And that Islam can make a contribution at every level of the society. And that we should be very frank and confident about that. Is that we have truth on our side. We're very blessed. And that, you know, we have to strive, you know, to make these things a reality. But we have to think, you know, we don't have to think outside the box, really. There's no box that you have to think outside of in Islam. You have to think outside of the box that some people set up as the parameters of the box. But ultimately, we have the true parameters. We never have to think outside the box if that we truly are thinking according to the Sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ. Right? That you are thinking as vastly as you can possibly think. That if you are a true adherent of the Sunnah of Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, and we have to have the courage to go about doing what it is that we need to do. And cross-pollination is beautiful. It's good. And the more and more that we can have different people from different backgrounds, from different understandings, with different colors of skin, with different focuses coming together, working together for a collective good, that the more that each individual is going to be enriched. Inshallah ta'ala. Much of what I said is theoretical. I end up speaking longer than I wanted to, but inshallah, like if there's any comments, I guess, or criticisms, concerns, questions, remarks, you can throw rocks at me. Like as Uwais al-Qarni said that the children used to throw rocks at him. Uwais al-Qarni, from the Prophet said about he was a Sayyid al-Tabi'i, and to the point to make his feet bleed. And he said that children, he said, if you're gonna throw rocks at me, just throw pebbles, right? Because when you throw big rocks, it makes my feet bleed. It's hard for me to pray. Like I have blood coming out my body. He said, if you're gonna throw rocks, just throw pebbles. Brothers, sisters?
Yeah.
Hold
Jazakallah khair for your lecture. You spoke at the beginning of your talk about the concept of the revival of traditional Islam, and you said we should be quite candid when we're speaking about this. So I wanted to, know your opinion about the various streams of movement-centered Islam, and if you could just comment on how it emerged and what role it plays in the communities that we're building here in North America, because it is a popular concept.
Yeah, very good question. So the question is just to comment on, we had spoken earlier about traditional Islam, and we need to be very candid about that, our understanding of that and so forth. The question was how do we understand some of the manifestations of movement-oriented Islam be very popular, and how does that work and so forth. And that's a very vast topic, and there's books that have been written on that topic. In a nutshell, that one of the things I think that we have to be very careful is to critically examine and understand the way that Islam has transitioned into modernity, and that as the break of tradition came, that there were responses to modernity, and there was a series of responses. That there were those that say that we need to change our approach. There are those that said that we need to divorce ourselves entirely from the tradition. The tradition is the problem. There are those that said that we need to leave religion altogether and relegate it to the public sphere, to the private sphere. And there are those that said we need to place, different focuses that were placed. So, not to oversimplify things, because it differs conceptually, just as it differs the way that it manifests in different places in the Muslim world. But without doubt, that if you mean by movement-oriented Islam that different levels of engagement, right, no one would be against that. Meaning that our deen, without doubt, teaches us to engage. Okay? And that we should, in fact, engage at every level. But the key to engagement is that you engage based upon principle, and you engage based upon substance. So oftentimes there could be a critique of some of the more movement-oriented, is the lack of those two, in terms of principle, in terms of substance of engagement. Right? And that also at the same time is that there has been some of those involved in the more movement-oriented type strands, a critique of the traditional standpoint, and that almost a type of blaming, this is why we are in the position that we're in, which I think that from one perspective that there might be some level of validity of that in certain cases, right? But overall, I think that if you look though, that in retrospect over the past 100 years, and I think you have a very different, outlook, just not you, but just anyone, just in general, and that oftentimes is that those people that focus more on a traditional approach that were critiqued in the moment, 20 to 30 years later, people look back and like, oh my God, that actually made a lot of sense to respond in that particular way. And I think that we're seeing that right now in terms of engagement politically in the Muslim world, which I don't want to touch on that topic because open up a whole can of worms. Right? But that perhaps long term that would be just an example of that. And so that the key is when it comes to engagement is that the engagement based upon principle, and that the engagement based upon substance. And if that's there, we should engage at every level of society. And that the only thing that I would say in that is that we also have to have wisdom on when to engage, right? In what to engage in and when not to engage. What I mean by that is that our Prophet ﷺ informed us about there is certain situations. And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, there will be tribulations like the incessant darkness of night. And every moment it gets darker and darker and darker. And our Prophet said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that al-qa'imu khayrun min as-sa'i, wal-qa'id khayrun min al-qa'id. Meaning that the person who's actively involved, the person who's involved but not actively involved, is better than the person actively involved. The person who's sitting, he's not really involved, is better than the person who's involved. And so forth and so on. Meaning that there are certain times that our Prophet informed us of that, to be involved is that you're just going to make the water murkier. So we have to understand the wisdom of when that is when to be involved and when not to be involved, and what to be involved in. And that's a whole topic in and of itself that requires a lot of focus and a lot of discussion. But in the end, that's what I would do. How do we decipher between traditional Islam and sectarianism? How to identify the ulama to study with here in the West? Yeah, so this is really what I was getting at. That traditional Islam. That the key when we talk about tradition is that even using this word, some people don't like this word, and that it's like using the word sacred. You've only come now to have to use this word because that previously that even in Arabic you didn't speak about that which was sacred that often because there was an understanding of what was sacred. You didn't need to speak about it because the understanding was there. Same thing with traditional Islam. You're only speaking about traditional Islam now because that there's, other examples of things that are not traditional. Right? If that makes sense, what I'm saying. So that it relates to a Latin word that means to pass something down hand by hand. Okay, which is very similar to what we call talaqi, the process of learning from teachers, and it's also generally related to the whole concept of isnad, the initiatic chain. The chain of narration, right, back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That this is the heart and the foundation of what we call traditional Islam, classical Islam, is the chain of narration. And so, meaning all of the sciences that have reached us, whether it be tafsir, hadith, whether it be fiqh, whether it be usul, even in terms of the Arabic language, that there's an unbroken chain in that back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Likewise, the spiritual paths, likewise, various understandings of propagation of Islam, is that they have unbroken chains back to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's essentially that legacy and heritage that makes up the majority of Muslims, the majority of Muslim scholars throughout the centuries. Right? That's what we mean by traditional Islam in that sense. And the largest percentage of that were Sunni, and then there was a small percentage that were Shia, and there was a very small percentage of others that had more divergent beliefs. Okay? So that's what we mean by traditional Islam. As for sectarianism, is that this whole process, this is how I understand it, of trying to determine that which sect is the correct sect, which one has the correct understanding, and so forth and so on, and that oftentimes sectarianism leads to that takfir and excommunication, calling people Muslims and non-Muslims and so forth and so on, and that refusing to work with certain people for certain reasons, and that things of this sort, that a lot of these internal conflicts. And that without doubt, this was there at times within traditional Islam and so forth. The tendencies are there within human beings. And that, even in terms that there was minor manifestations of this, even between great scholars at times. And this is undeniable. However, that understanding historically what happened and in understanding at the same time what is right are two different things. Is that we have to understand that there are negative tendencies of sectarianism that have to be curbed and avoided. And a person's belief in and of themselves, la karaha fi din. You can't force someone to believe something or to not believe something. But when it leads to the level of calling other people non-Muslim, or it leads to the level of spilling blood, most importantly, la ilaha illallah Rasulullah, here it starts to get very, 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 very serious. Right? So it all depends on kind of what you're focused on and how you define sectarianism. But the idea here is that moving forward in a positive fashion, especially living in lands like the ones in which we live, where they're non-Muslim countries, is that there's no ahkam sultaniya. Right? There's no rules of governance here. Right? That we should be working in the way that we mentioned previously, according to the maslahah of the benefit and the issues that affect us all, is to the degree that we should be working together. And then that we should also remember, as Imam Malik said, لَيْسَتْ مِنَ السُنَّةِ أَن تُجَادِلْ بِالسُنَّةِ. It is not from the sunnah to argue with others about the sunnah. وَلَكِنْ مِنَ السُنَّةِ أَن تُخْبِرْ بِالسُنَّةِ. That it's the sunnah to just inform other people about the sunnah. And that's really what is at the heart of this, and and in the end of the day, that what's the whole? Why was the Qur'an sent? If someone asked you to define, what is the main objective of the Qur'an, what would you say? What's the whole purpose the Qur'an was sent? Hidayah, to know your Lord. The Qur'an was sent to take you to Allah Ta'ala. And this is the main problem I have with sectarianism and all of its manifestations is that people forget why they were created. They forget why the Prophet was sent. They forget why the Qur'an was sent. And they become overly polemical, and they spend all their time talking about other people. Where if you would just say, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, in this place, you figure out, you would attain what it is that religion was sent for you to attain. And so that this is why that we have to be very careful of falling into these tendencies, and especially when it comes to calling people non-Muslim, and then spilling blood. La ilaha illallah. Because once you start doing that, that you open up a huge door. One example of that, I was just asked a question recently that because there's things that relate to that. If someone leaves Islam, divorce issues and so forth, and so that people are very hasty in these regards. Oh, look, he's a kafir. So telling his wife that, oh, you're divorced to him, and then it just gets really messy when people have these tendencies. And how to identify the ulama to study here in the West. What I would say is I would read the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Read Martin Link's seerah about the Prophet ﷺ. Come to know your Prophet, and then come to know the ulama in the West that remind you of the Prophet. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And once you know who the Prophet is, you have the essential standard and measure for who is a true scholar and who's not a true scholar, and to what degree someone is a true scholar. That's it. You come to know your Prophet ﷺ, and that you will then know, in particular, that his seerah and his shama'il. And so that if you're with someone and you leave and you're angry, and you come back and you're thinking about who's Muslim, who's not a Muslim, who's and all these type of things, and you find that you're that what I would say as well is like a very particular thing. That's in general, and the particular one is that those that you study with, that you find that when you leave their measures, you have more mercy. So even if you go home and your spouse is not practicing at all, they just criticize you for being there, that you're taught to smile and to be even more loving and to be even more compassionate. That you go outside and you see a Muslim walk out of a liquor store carrying a bottle of alcohol, that you even have more mercy in your heart for them than you would have before you went to that class. You increase in mercy and you increase in humility. Those are the type of gatherings, those are the type of ulama that you want to sit with. Is that when you leave their majalis, even if it's a majlis of ilm, where you're studying fiqh, that you come out with a softer heart that's in a state of greater humility, in a state of greater mercy. And if you find those people, then those are the people that you want to spend time with. If one realizes they need to do more to seek Islamic knowledge, what should they do? I.e., how do they know where to start? What class would be suitable? MashaAllah, if you're here in the Toronto area, you're in good hands. There's enormous opportunities that you all have here. That really, you all are very, very blessed here to have the infrastructure that you have here. If you just go to different Kennedys, go to Montreal, go to Ottawa, go to Calgary, go to different places and see, the opportunities that people have there to study compared to the opportunities that people have here locally. But you have immense opportunities here. In general, that where to start and what to study, the most important thing is your individual obligations. I would study a basic primer on your individual obligations. After you do that, I would study a more detailed text in theology. After you do that, I'd study a more detailed text on law, fiqh. After that, I would study a more detailed text in purification of the heart. Then after that, I would study a larger text in law. And if you did all of that, you'd be in a very good state. And then you could, regularly just keep increasing, take different disciplines and so forth, and then, move forward after that.
There's some questions online.
Online, okay.
So besides catching some people who are also online in this lesson, there's someone just making a declaration.
Oh, there's people like putting online questions in there here?
No, they're reading.
Oh.
On Facebook. I was just a bit out, please. There's a declaration of love. Someone said, I just want to say I love Shaykh Yahya and always learn so much from him. May Allah bless him. There's a question that Shaykh Yahya mentioned the Shia. We do a lot of interfaith projects with non-Muslims, but we never seem to invite our Shia brethren to such projects. Why don't we never interact with them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and these type of questions, I don't know if I have a definitive answer on it, and a lot of these things need to be really calculated in terms of what is the best position to take and so forth. And that we mentioned the general principle to the various degree that we should engage in upon what basis and depending upon the benefit and so forth, that you expand it to a broader and broader target of people. And so based upon that principle, you'd have to look at this individual situation. But this is something that I think that an onlooker in, that it is just as for a Muslim to understand all the nuances of the various denominations of Christianity, that becomes a bit difficult unless you're a specialist at it. And so the key to me would be that if there's going to be a Sunni and a Shiite type platform and an interfaith type crowd, would be is that they have a relationship among themselves such that they only focus on the commonalities while respectfully mentioning the differences. If it becomes kind of a tit for tat type thing in an interfaith type environment, that seems to me to be counterproductive. Which you would actually be surprised is the majority of things with the Sunnis and the Shiites are actually the exact same, and that the differences are actually, that even though at times significant, that they're actually very small in terms of percentages. And that I remember I performed a pilgrimage some time ago, and I was in a room. It just so happened that there was 2 other Shiite brothers who were working in Yemen, and that we had long, extensive conversations. And the majority of the hadith he was quoting from their sources were all hadith that we have in our own books. And that it would reach a point where he wanted to say something about the Sahaba. I said, here you have to stop. Right? Stop here. That's somewhere where I'm not willing to go. And they were respectful, so we were able to have a rapport. And I think that if that's the case, that there could be a benefit in that if we present our selves to the greater. So I think that could potentially be, given certain conditions, something that could be worked out to answer that question.
You mentioned, and I've answered the first question, it's very important to know when to engage and when not to engage and how to engage. And I think to me that's a very critical skill or that wisdom to have that kind of knowledge. It's very important, but how do you acquire that and how do you have that sense?
So the question is that we were discussing the importance of when to engage and when not to engage, and then that how to engage when we do engage, and how do we know how to do this, practically speaking. And exactly, this is not something that's easy, and that's one of the tribulations in our times. Just when you finally figure out something to do, some new thing comes up that you have to readjust yourself and reposition yourself. But that these conversations need to take place amongst learned people in conjunction with people of specialization, and depending upon what exactly it is at stake here. So if it's something pertaining to war, that you bring in specialists that can help you discuss that, particularly something related to economics that you're dealing with. You have learned people dealing with specialists that know the nature of what that very thing is that you're trying to come to some type of conclusion on. The media, for instance, what is going to be our position on the media? That these are very serious things that require a lot of thought and require people coming together and then that putting out something at least semi-definitive that can then reach the people so they can understand that. And that this is we're really lacking in this. And what ends up happening is that people just kind of end up going on their own and just doing whatever it is that they what they need to do. There's a short-term solution to that, and there's a long-term solution. The short-term solution is that before someone embarks upon something in and of themselves, is that they should seek ask people of knowledge what's the best way to approach it. Right? Even if it only be 2 or 3 people, and there'll be safety in that, and so that they can do it with knowledge. That the long term is what we just said, is that we have to create environments where people can healthily and comfortably come together, discuss these issues with specialists in the various fields, and to come to some type of semi-definitive conclusions that can then be distributed amongst the greater population. So it's not an easy and microwavable answer, but
you said that we should have an Islam that has to be rooted in the people. What exactly?
So we made a comment that we have to have an Islam that's rooted in the people. What exactly did I mean by that? What I meant by that is that in the end of the day, the most important thing is the people. Right? Meaning that the Prophet came to guide people. That institutions are supposed to serve people. And that whatever it might be, events, conferences, whatever, organizations, in the end of the day, it's about the people. So meaning once we understand is that the whole goal is the people, and the bettering of the state of the people, is that the people actually take precedence then. Meaning that if your focus is people, that you will make sure that people are welcomed in their, they leave with a warm, heartfelt feeling, is that you don't differentiate between people based upon their economic background or the color of their skin or any of that. Meaning that you make the people a priority, and that you never distance yourselves so much that it prevents you from being with the people. And that one of the critiques, I think, which is a valid critique, is that people have seen traditional Islam at this point as being a type of elitist type tendency. And that there's reasons for that, where I don't think that was like a conscious thing, but there are critiques of that, and that to me is that the Prophet ﷺ, that he was with the people, meaning that he was the most beloved person of Allah Ta'ala, to Allah Ta'ala, the most knowledgeable, the strongest intellect, the most worshipful, but at the same time, everyone had easy access to him. Anyone that wanted to come talk to the Prophet or be with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that they had access to him. Whether they were a maidservant, a dark-skinned bondswoman, or whether they were an aristocrat, or anywhere in between. The Prophet was accessible and he lived the most transparent life. And to me, moving forward, this is really at the heart of community, is that we need living examples of people that are living and embodying Islam. And that, I think that we have to deal with the celebrity culture in which we deal in which we live. We have to play with that for certain dawah initiatives, but it should all channel into the foundation of the foundations, which is that people living Islam by example, and that regular interaction at the masjid and learning centers and so forth. And that's how people change, is that when people are accessible. So that's what I meant by that. Okay, what is the best way to inspire someone to become interested in learning the deen, who while still Muslims have become somewhat rebellious or confused about tradition? That one of the things that I've found in that regard is that I regularly come into contact with people of this type. And I think that it's important to speak to people without readily placing a judgment on them. Meaning that you have to speak to them in a way that they feel comfortable talking to you. That if you just start attacking them and just close them off, they're just going to become more rebellious and more confused. And that you have to let people get out what it is that they have inside. And that you have to attempt to understand from their perspective how they came to that. And there might have been some event that happened in their life, some experience. There might be some type of knot that has nothing to do with anything intellectual. It's actually spiritual that's there. Were that to be removed, the intellectual part is all worked out. So what I found is that the best way is that it requires knowledge on your end, is to people have questions, and they should be free to ask. Not only should they're free to ask their questions, that we're required Islamically, if you don't understand something, to ask that question. And to me, I've always found the tradition to have the most convincing answers. So I'm not, there's things that I don't know how to answer for sure. And if we don't know something, so I don't know. But I don't feel like I don't feel, let's see, what would the word be? I don't feel, I feel confident enough about the tradition that just let people bring out what they have inside. And let's talk about it. And that I'll do my best, if I think you're wrong, to convince you otherwise. But I don't want them to feel, if people feel like they can't have an open conversation, that's counterproductive. They should be able to get it all out. And then that we should be able to, be in a very convincing, rational fashion, convince them otherwise with what we believe to be from the tradition. And I found that has been, because to be honest with you, that sometimes people put out questions, and they're good questions. There really are good questions. There's just not people to answer them correctly, or they haven't gotten the correct answers. And that's no one's perfect. Not everyone can answer all the questions, but at the same time, you can't fault them for not getting convincing answers. And so that I think we're just very open like that, and then that is how I've personally found the best way. But that requires, though, a knowledge to bring them back. And that I know teachers of mine that are very open about this. And one in particular is Habib Ali Jifri, who last Ramadan that did a series of lectures on public television of this sort. Is that he invited people from all different backgrounds that had all different ways of thinking, and they just discussed very openly about their perspective and his perspective and so forth. And that this is the way that my teachers were. Is I think we should be very open about these things, and then you'll find that if that's the case, a lot of times these people are used to people, unfortunately, there's a bit of they're demagogues in a sense that they're kind of shut down. Don't think like that. No, just don't even think like that. I just didn't. Right? And that's not going to help someone get rid. That's going to make them more rebellious than tradition. No, let it out. Okay, then we'll talk about it. So, let's calm down as well.
Last question.
Okay. Shaykh Faraj should be answering these questions. I don't know.
There's a question, basically, why are some scholars, or many of the scholars, disengaged from larger societal issues and politics?
So, I'm sure everyone heard that question. I think that that is a critique sometimes that you hear, and I think societal issues are one thing. Among the societal issues are politics, and then politics is something else. One of the, when Habib Omar was here, he was at the IMO, and one morning he was asked about, something of this sort, about the scholars' engagement in, these events and so forth that were taking place. This was right around the time of the Arab Spring and so forth. And he mentioned a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where the man came to the Prophet and he said that he grabbed the Prophet very roughly until he made his neck turn red. He said that, Ya Banu Hashim, O tribe of Hashim, innukum butal, you delay paying back your debts. Give me the money that you owe me. Sayyidina Umar was there and wanted to pull out the sword, cut the head off of this munafiq, and that he wanted to kill him, and he scared him, and that then the Prophet ﷺ said to Umar, Ya Umar, that he and I were in more need of something greater than that from you. U'murhu bil husn al-talab, right? Ask him to ask well, and ask me to pay back my debts right. So what Habib Umar took from this hadith is that the role of the scholar before Arab Spring, during Arab Spring, after Arab Spring, before the Mongol invasion, during the Mongol invasion, after the Mongol invasion, before the Crusades, during the Crusades, after the Crusades, before 9/11, during 9/11, after 9/11 is the same. Is that the point of the position of a scholar is that they should be in a neutral space, is that they advise both the Hakim and the Mahkum. They advise both the scholar and they advise both the ruler and the ruled. That the scholar has to be in an independent space is where they advise everyone to do what is right accordingly. This is the lofty position of a scholar. And so meaning is that sometimes the scholars might be considered to be that back out a little bit But in reality, they're back out of it because they have to stay out of certain things in order to properly advise both sides. And so that you could critique them for being disengaged, but in fact they're not disengaged. They're precisely disengaged so that they can be engaged. Right? And having said that, there are a few scholars here and there that have, really isolated themselves, and that, Islam doesn't create a monolithic type Muslim. There's room for that in our tradition. Is that you need worshippers in society for the society to function, just as you need different parts of the human body to be there for the human body to function. You need worshippers. You need people that are going to be disengaged, and then you need people that are going to be partially disengaged, and then you need people that are actively going to take out certain things under the guidance of the ulama. There's certain things that the scholars, it's not befitting for them to be actively involved in, that they should be disengaged precisely so that they can fulfill their function of advising, both sides. But to expect everyone to be involved in everything and every initiative, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's not how companies work. That's not how governments work. That's not the way anything works. That in order for a company to function properly, is that if the CEO was having to serve coffee, right, or sweep the floors, how is he going? The CEO has to be disengaged from what the janitors are doing. He has to be disengaged from what the salesmen are doing, precisely because he's dealing with the overall direction. And if a situation arises to deal with one particular who steps out of line, he can deal with that individual. So it's the same thing that even in dunya, why would we think it's different in terms of deen? And it's a good question though. And so this applies in general to everything that is taking place, but also applies in particular to politics. Is that for the most part, our scholars are very wary of politics, and because of the danger involved in it. But it's not an absolute, because that the best rulers are those that are at the door of scholars, and the worst scholars are those that are at the door of rulers. The first is absolute, and the second is relative. Meaning that absolutely under no condition, without condition, that the best scholars, the best rulers are those who seek the advice of the scholars. Whereas the scholars who are at the door of the rulers, that's conditional, right? They're the worst scholars if they're in it for something worldly. But if they're going to advise politicians with righteous intentions, then that's something that is a good thing. Right? But again, it's about a very simple, breakdown of the whole function of what scholar is, and that's how we understand things in Lana's best. Maybe Shaykh Faraz has something to add on that.
Inshallah, Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Yahya. We're going to be breaking for Maghrib, inshallah, and closing for tonight, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And we do have a whole series of programs coming up, including tomorrow evening, again, here at the Hub, and then Wednesday at IMO. If you go to the SeekersHub website, you can see the whole listing of the different programs, and do encourage friends and family to come along as well. And hopefully, if you're taking notes, there's a lot of points that Shaykh Yahya has left with us to reflect upon that we should really take very seriously. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
You already have your hand up.
الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. We praise Allah and are thankful to Him for Him having guided us to this, and had He not guided us, we surely would not be guided. We thank Allah for every blessing that He has bestowed upon us inwardly and outwardly, and we ask Him that He make us of His truly thankful servants who recognize and appreciate His blessings, and who direct every blessing to the best of what it was created for being true lovers of Allah, being true seekers of Allah, being of those who know Allah and who worship Him as though we behold Him, of those who have the prophetic concern deep in our hearts, so that we wish for others as we wish for ourselves, and that we have deep care and concern and love and mercy for all of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make us of those whom He has wished well for, of those whom He grants deep understanding of religion, of those whom He directs on the path of seeking Him in all that we do. We ask Him to make us of those who remember Him much and who are always in the service of our family and our friends and our community and all His creation on the footsteps of the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that just as He has united us here with those whom we love and those whom we ascribe ourselves to, that He gather us in the highest of company of the one through whose ascription we are believers, our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the highest of companies under your good pleasure and love, Ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala al-nur al-mubin سيد الأولين والآخرين إمام المتقين الهادي إلى صراط مستقيم سيدنا ونبينا محمد السراج المنير وعلى آله وأصحابه أهل التنوير وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين.